In the small frontier town of Millbrook, nestled between rolling hills and endless plains, lived a young woman named Emma Thompson. She was 25 years old with kind brown eyes and gentle hands that knew how to heal. Emma was the town's only doctor, having learned her healing skills from her late father who had passed away 2 years earlier. She ran a modest clinic from her small wooden house on Oak Street, where she treated everyone from crying babies to elderly folks with aching bones. Emma's days were always busy. She would wake up early each morning to prepare her medicines and organize her medical supplies. The townspeople trusted her completely because she had helped deliver their children and nursed them through difficult illnesses. Her father had taught her that being a doctor meant more than just knowing about medicine. He had told her many times that a true healer must have compassion in their heart for all living creatures. The small clinic was simple but clean. Emma had wooden shelves filled with glass bottles containing different medicines and herbs. She had a comfortable bed for patients who needed to rest, and a desk where she kept her father's old medical books. The walls were painted white, and sunlight streamed through the clean windows during the day. Everything in the clinic smelled of soap and healing herbs that Emma grew in her small garden behind the hoe. It was a cold autumn evening in late October when everything changed for Emma. The wind was blowing hard outside, making the tree branches scratch against her windows. She had just finished treating old Mr. Peterson's cough and was cleaning up her medical instruments when she heard something unusual. At first, she thought it might be a stray dog or perhaps a raccoon looking for food near her garbage. But then she heard it again, a soft groan that sounded definitely human. Emma's heart began to beat faster. She grabbed her oil lantern from the kitchen table and wrapped her warm shawl round her shoulders carefully. She opened her back door and stepped outside into the chilly night air. The moon was bright enough to help her see, and Emma followed the sound round to the back of her clinic. There, collapsed near her stone well, lay a man. He was clearly hurt badly and appeared to be unconscious. As Emma moved closer with her lantern, she could see that he was an Apache warrior. His long black hair was tied back, and he wore traditional leather clothing with colorful beadwork. Emma's heart raced with fear and concern at the same time. The townspeople of Millbrook had always feared the Apache tribe. There had been conflicts and misunderstandings between the settlers and the native people for many years. Most folks in town would probably turn away anyone who wasn't part of their own community, especially during these tense times. Some people had even lost family members in past conflicts, and the fear ran deep in many hearts. But as Emma knelt down beside the wounded man, she remembered her father's most important lesson. He had told her many times throughout her childhood and medical training that a doctor's duty was to heal, no matter who needed help. Her father had said that pain and suffering looked the same on every person, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. He had taught her that when someone was hurt and dying, nothing else mattered except saving their life. The Apache man's leg was badly injured with what looked like a deep wound, possibly from a bullet or an arrow. He was burning with fever, and his breathing was shallow and difficult. Emma knew that without immediate medical attention, this man would certainly die before morning. Without any more hesitation, Emma made her decision. She managed to help the injured man to his feet and slowly guided him into her clinic through the back door. He was much taller and heavier than her, but somehow she found the strength to get him inside and onto her medical bed. The man was barely conscious, but his dark eyes showed gratitude even through his pain. Emma immediately went to work. She lit more oil lamps to give herself better light to see the wounds clearly. She heated water on her wood stove and gathered clean bandages, medicines, and surgical tools. The leg wound was indeed serious, and Emma had to carefully clean it and remove small pieces of debris. She gave him medicine to help with the fever and pain, then carefully stitched the worst parts of the wound. Through the long night, Emma stayed awake watching over her patient. She discovered that his name was Joseph when he whispered it during a brief moment of consciousness. Despite the language barrier between them, Emma could see in his grateful eyes that he understood she was trying to save his life. She changed his bandages, gave him water to drink, and made sure his fever was going down. As the first light of dawn began to creep through her clinic windows, Emma knew her secret wouldn't stay hidden for very long. The people of Millbrook would soon discover what she had done. But as she looked at Joseph sleeping peacefully with his breathing now steady and strong, Emma felt certain in her heart that she had done exactly what was right. The morning sun had barely risen over the hills surrounding Millbrook when Mrs. Wilson made her regular bread delivery rounds. She was a plump, cheerful woman who had been baking for the town for over 15 years. Every morning she carried her wicker basket filled with warm loaves of bread to the homes and businesses of her neighbors. The smell of fresh bread always made people smile and welcome her warmly. Mrs. Wilson approached Emma's clinic with her usual friendly attitude. Planning to leave a loaf on the doorstep as she always did, Emma was one of her favorite customers, because she always paid on time and often complimented her baking. But this morning would be different from all the others. As Mrs. Wilson walked up to the front window to peek inside and see if Emma was awake, she expected to see the familiar sight of the clean, empty clinic. Instead, she gasped loudly and dropped her basket of bread onto the ground. There, sleeping peacefully on Emma's medical bed, was a man she immediately recognized as an Apache warrior. His long black hair, leather clothing, and the beadwork on his shirt made his identity unmistakable. Mrs. Wilson's face turned pale with shock and fear. She had never seen an Apache person this close before, and certainly not inside someone's home in their town. Her heart began beating so fast that she felt dizzy. Without thinking clearly, she began running down Oak Street toward the center of town, shouting at the top of her voice, "Help! Help! There's an Apache in Emma's clinic." She screamed as she ran. "Come quickly. Something terrible is happening." Her desperate cries woke up everyone within several blocks. People came rushing out of their houses in their night clothes, still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Within just a few minutes, a large crowd of angry and frightened townspeople had gathered in the street in front of Emma's small clinic. Mayor Richards, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He was known for being a fair leader, but he was also very protective of his town and its people. Behind him came Mr. Andrews, who owned the general store, and Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher. More and more people joined the crowd until nearly half the town was standing in Emma's front yard. Their faces were red with fury and fear. Many of them were shouting angrily, and their words were harsh and cutting. The peaceful morning had suddenly turned into chaos, and Emma could hear every angry word from inside her clinic. "How could you help our enemy?" shouted Mr. Andrews, his voice filled with rage. He pointed an accusing finger at Emma's front door. "You have betrayed all of us. You've put us all in danger," cried Mrs. Patterson, her voice shaking with emotion. "What if more of them come looking for him? What if they attack our children?" Emma heard all the commotion and quickly stepped outside to face the angry crowd. She had never seen so many of her neighbors looking at her with such hatred and disappointment. Her hands were shaking as she tried to speak calmly and explain her actions. "Please listen to me," Emma said, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "He was dying when I found him. I took an oath as a doctor to help anyone who needs healing, regardless of who they are." But the crowd wouldn't listen to her explanations. Their fear and anger had grown too strong, and they were not interested in hearing her reasons. Many people began shouting even louder. calling her terrible names and accusing her of being a traitor to her own people. "You should have let him die," someone yelled from the back of the crowd. "You care more about them than about us," shouted another voice. The worst part for Emma was seeing the faces of people she had known and cared for throughout her entire life. These weren't strangers criticizing her actions. These were people she had helped during their most difficult moments. She had delivered their babies, treated their illnesses, and sat with them during their darkest hours when they thought they might die. Young Lucy Miller, whose broken arm Emma had carefully mended just last month, stood near the front of the crowd. Emma looked at her hopefully, remembering how grateful Lucy and her parents had been when Emma had worked for hours to set the bone properly. But Lucy wouldn't even look at Emma now. Instead, she turned her head away and moved closer to her mother, as if Emma had become someone dangerous and frightening. Old Tom Harris, whom Emma had nursed through a terrible case of pneumonia during the previous winter, was also in the crowd. Emma remembered sitting by his bedside for 3 days and nights, giving him medicine and making sure he stayed warm. She had probably saved his life. But now Tom looked at her with disgust, spat on the ground, and walked away without saying a word. Emma felt her world crumbling round her like a house made of cards falling down. These people weren't just her patients or customers. They were her community, her extended family, the only people she had left in the world since her father had died. She had grown up with many of them, played with their children, shared meals at community gatherings, and celebrated holidays together. Now she stood completely alone in front of her own home, facing a crowd of people who wanted her to leave town immediately. She had only her conscience to comfort her in this terrible moment. That evening, as the sun began to set behind the rolling hills, Emma sat quietly in her clinic, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her entire life. The angry voices of the townspeople still echoed in her mind, and she could barely believe how quickly her neighbors had turned against her. She had spent the whole day inside, afraid to go out and face more harsh words from people she had once considered friends. Joseph had been resting peacefully for most of the day, but now Emma noticed that he was becoming more alert. His fever had broken completely, and the color was returning to his face. The medicine she had given him was working well, and his injured leg was already beginning to heal properly. Emma felt glad to see that her patient was getting better, even though everything else in her life seemed to be falling apart. As the room grew darker, Emma lit a small lamp and placed it on the table beside Joseph's bed. The warm yellow light made the clinic feel a bit more comfortable, though Emma's heart still felt heavy with sadness. She had been thinking all day about what she would do next, knowing that she could no longer stay in the town where she had been born and raised. Joseph slowly opened his eyes and looked round the room. He seemed much stronger now, and for the first time since Emma had found him, he was able to sit up on his own. Emma quickly moved to help him, making sure he didn't hurt his injured leg. As she helped him get comfortable, Joseph looked directly into her eyes with an expression of deep gratitude. Joseph could see the sadness in Emma's eyes, and even though he didn't speak much English, he understood what had happened to her because of her kindness to him. He had heard the angry voices outside during the day, and he knew that helping him had caused Emma serious trouble with her own people. This knowledge made him feel both grateful and guilty at the same time. "Thank you, Joseph," whispered in careful English, placing his hand over his heart in a gesture that showed his sincere appreciation. His voice was still weak, but his words were clear and full of meaning. "You good person." Emma felt tears starting to form in her eyes as she heard his simple but heartfelt words. After a day of being called terrible names and accused of betraying her community, It meant everything to hear someone recognize that she had acted with good intentions. She managed a small smile through her tears. The first time she had smiled since the morning's terrible events. "I couldn't just let you suffer," Emma replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Any doctor would have done the same thing. But even as she said these words, Emma knew they weren't really true. Most doctors in her situation probably would have turned away, afraid of the consequences from their own community. She had made a choice that was difficult and dangerous, and now she was paying the price for following her conscience. Joseph listened carefully to her words, and then slowly reached into the small leather pouch that he wore around his waist. His movements were careful and deliberate, showing respect for the moment from inside the pouch. He pulled out a small, beautiful beaded bracelet that had been carefully crafted by skilled hands. The beadwork was intricate and colorful, with tiny glass beads in shades of blue, white, and gold. He gently placed the bracelet in Emma's palm, and she could see that the beadwork showed the pattern of a dove, in flight with its wings spread wide. Emma had learned enough about Apache culture from her father to know that the dove was a symbol of peace and hope. The bracelet was clearly something precious and meaningful, not just a simple gift. "My people will remember," Joseph said softly, his words carrying a promise that Emma didn't fully understand yet. He spoke slowly, choosing each English word carefully to make sure she understood the importance of what he was telling her. As darkness fell completely over the town of Millbrook, Joseph knew it was time for him to leave. He was strong enough now to travel, and staying longer would only make things more difficult for Emma. He stood up carefully, testing his injured leg and finding that it could support his weight without too much pain. Emma helped him gather his few belongings, then walked with him to the back door of her clinic. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, both understanding that this was goodbye. Joseph looked at her one more time with deep respect, then quietly slipped away into the night. Emma watched from her window as Joseph walked carefully across her backyard and disappeared into the dark. As beyond, his figure became smaller until she could no longer see him against the starlit sky. She stood at the window for a long time, holding the beaded bracelet in her hands and thinking about the strange events of the past 2 days. The next morning, Emma began the painful task of packing her belongings. The townspeople had made it very clear that she was no longer welcome in Millbrook, and she knew she had no choice but to leave. Her heart was heavy as she carefully folded her father's precious medical books and gathered her healing supplies, instruments, and medicines. She had lost everything that mattered to her: her home, her medical practice, and her community. But somehow, as she held Joseph's bracelet and remembered his grateful words, Emma didn't regret the choice she had made. 3 days had passed since Joseph disappeared into the darkness, and Emma spent those lonely days slowly preparing to leave the only home she had ever known. Her small wooden house felt empty and sad as she carefully packed her belongings into wooden crates and cloth bags. Every item she touched brought back memories of her life in Millbrook, making the task even more difficult and heartbreaking. Emma had decided to travel to the larger city of Denver, where she hoped to find work as a doctor in a hospital or clinic. She had written a letter to a medical colleague of her father's, asking if there might be opportunities for her there, though she was afraid of starting over in a place where she knew no one. Emma knew she had to be brave and make a new life for herself. On this particular morning, Emma was loading her few possessions into the old wooden wagon that had belonged to her father. The wagon wasn't very big, but it was sturdy and would carry everything she owned. She had packed her father's medical books, her surgical instruments, bottles of medicine, clean bandages, and her personal belongings. Everything that represented her life and career as a doctor fit into this one small wagon. As Emma lifted a heavy crate of medical supplies, she paused to wipe the sweat from her forehead and looked out toward the horizon. The morning was clear and bright, with a gentle breeze blowing across the plains, but something caught her attention that made her stop what she was doing and stare into the distance. Far out on the horizon, Emma could see a small dust cloud moving steadily toward town. At first, she thought it might be the weekly supply wagon that brought goods from the larger cities to Millbrook's shops and stores. But something about this dust cloud seemed different. It was moving faster than a supply wagon would travel, and it seemed to be coming from the wrong direction. Emma shaded her eyes with her hand and squinted to see better. The dust cloud wasn't behaving like the usual supply wagon or traveling merchants who occasionally passed through their town. This looked like something else entirely, though Emma couldn't quite figure out what it might be. Meanwhile, far away on the Apache reservation, Joseph had returned to his tribe with much more than just his life. During his long journey home, he had thought carefully about how to tell his people about the remarkable woman who had saved him. When he finally reached his village, he went straight to see his grandfather, Chief William, who was the wisest and most respected elder of their tribe. Chief William was an old man with silver hair and deep lines on his face that showed the wisdom he had gained through many years of life. He listened carefully as Joseph told him the complete story of what had happened. Joseph explained how he had been wounded and left for dead, how the white doctor named Emma had found him and risked everything to save his life, and how her own people had turned against her because of her kindness to him. This woman has shown the old ways, Chief William said slowly to his people after hearing Joseph's story. His voice was deep and thoughtful, and everyone in the village listened respectfully. When he spoke, she has honored life above fear, just as our ancestors taught us to do. We must honor her courage according to our ancient traditions. The chief explained to his tribe that in the old days, when someone showed such extraordinary kindness and bravery, it was their responsibility to recognize and honor that person. He said that Emma's actions had shown the true spirit of healing and compassion that transcended the boundaries between different peoples. Word spread quickly through the Apache community about Emma's selfless act. The story traveled from family to family, from village to village, as people shared the remarkable tale of the white doctor who had chosen to save a life rather than protect herself from her community's anger. Many people were moved by Emma's courage and wanted to do something to show their respect and gratitude. The tribal council met and decided that such bravery and compassion deserved recognition according to their ancient traditions. They began making preparations for a special ceremony, gathering their finest horses and most colorful ceremonial clothing. This would be an honor that had not been given to an outsider in many years. Back in Millbrook, the people were starting to notice the approaching dust cloud as well. They gathered in small groups on the main street, pointing toward the horizon and talking nervously among themselves. As the dust cloud grew closer, they could make out that it wasn't a wagon at all, but riders, many riders, more riders than they had ever seen approaching their town at one time. Fear began to grip the people of Millbrook as they prepared for what they thought might be trouble. Some families hurried their children inside their houses and locked their doors. Shop owners closed their shutters and hid their valuable goods. Mayor Richards organized some of the men to stand guard, though they all felt nervous and unprepared for whatever might be coming. But Emma felt something completely different in her heart as she watched the approaching riders. The beaded bracelet that Joseph had given her seemed to grow warm against her wrist, almost as if it were trying to tell her something important, deep inside. Emma sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would change everything she thought she knew about her situation. As the morning mist began to clear from the rolling hills round Millbrook, the mysterious dust cloud finally revealed what it had been hiding. 50 Apache riders appeared at the edge of town, moving slowly and deliberately across the open plains. The sight was both magnificent and overwhelming for the people of Millbrook, who had never seen so many Apache warriors gathered together in one place. The riders were dressed in their finest ceremonial clothes, wearing colorful blankets draped over their shoulders and beautiful feathered headbands that caught the morning sunlight. Their horses were decorated with painted symbols and beaded bridles that showed this was a special occasion, not an ordinary visit. At the front of this impressive group rode Joseph, looking strong and healthy on his spotted horse, and beside him was an elderly man with silver hair and wise eyes who could only be their chief. The townspeople of Millbrook gathered nervously in the main street, whispering to each other and trying to understand what was happening. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, and men stood protectively near their families. Everyone felt uncertain and afraid, remembering the conflicts and misunderstandings that had existed between their communities for so many years. But as the Apache riders came closer, something unexpected happened. Instead of making any threatening moves or showing signs of anger, the warriors began to arrange themselves in a very specific and purposeful way. They formed two perfect lines along the main road of Millbrook, creating a wide path of honor that stretched from one end of the street to the other. Emma stood beside her loaded wagon, watching in complete amazement as this extraordinary scene unfolded before her eyes. The beaded bracelet on her wrist felt warm and seemed to pulse gently, as if it were somehow connected to what was happening. She had never seen anything so beautiful and meaningful in her entire life. Chief William, the elderly leader at the front of the group, slowly dismounted from his horse with the dignity and grace of someone who had led his people through many difficult times. He was tall and proud, wearing traditional leather clothing decorated with intricate beadwork and carrying himself with the quiet authority of a true leader. His weathered face showed both strength and kindness. The entire town of Millbrook held its breath as Chief William walked slowly toward Emma. Every person on the street stood completely still, sensing that they were witnessing something historic and important. The only sounds were the gentle snorting of horses and the soft morning breeze rustling through the trees. When Chief William reached Emma, he stopped and looked at her with deep respect and gratitude. His English was broken but clear, and he spoke loud enough for everyone in the town to hear his important words. "This woman," he said, his voice carrying across the silent street, "she saved my grandson. She showed great heart. We come to honor her." Joseph dismounted from his horse and walked over to join his grandfather. He looked at Emma with the same grateful expression she remembered from their time together in her clinic. Gently and respectfully, he helped Emma down from her wagon, treating her as if she were the most honored person in the world. With tears streaming down her face, Emma began to walk slowly between the two lines of Apache riders. Each warrior sat tall and proud in his saddle, showing their deep respect for her courage and compassion. They had painted their faces with special ceremonial colors, and many wore eagle feathers that represented honor and bravery. As Emma passed by each rider, they nodded respectfully, acknowledging her as someone worthy of their highest admiration. The townspeople of Millbrook watched this incredible ceremony in complete amazement. For the first time, they began to truly understand what Emma's act of kindness had meant, not just to Joseph and his family, but to an entire community of people. They realized that a decision to save a life had been seen by the Apache people as something sacred and worthy of great honor. Slowly, one by one, the people of Millbrook began to step forward from their doorways and hiding places. They started to see Emma not as someone who had betrayed them, but as someone who had shown extraordinary courage and compassion. Mayor Richards was the first to remove his hat and bow his head in respect. his face showing genuine remorse for how badly they had treated her. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice filled with shame and regret. "We were wrong about everything. Will you please stay and continue being our doctor?" Emma looked round at the faces of her neighbors, the same people who had called her Tell names and demanded that she leave town just a few days before. But now their expressions had completely changed. They looked at her with new understanding, genuine remorse, and deep respect for what she had done. "Of course," Emma said with a warm smile that lit up her entire face. "Healing is what I do, and this is my home." Chief William nodded approvingly at her words and spoke once more, his voice carrying the wisdom of many generations. "The dove flies where there is peace. You bring peace to all people." As the Apache riders quietly prepared to depart, turning their horses toward home, Emma realized that sometimes losing everything helps us discover what truly matters most. Her act of compassion had not only saved Joseph's life, but it had also built a bridge of understanding between two communities, and shown everyone the incredible power of doing what is right, even when it seems impossible. The end.